For centuries, scholars have debated what the earliest human records actually say about the origins of life, paradise, and the collapse of a perfect world. Most of what we know comes from a handful of widely accepted texts, carefully curated, carefully edited, and in many cases carefully incomplete. But deep in the highlands of Ethiopia, inside stone monasteries that most of the world has never heard of, a different set of records survived. Records that predate many of the canonical texts we consider authoritative. Records that were not lost, not destroyed, but deliberately preserved by monks who understood exactly what they were protecting. One of those documents is called The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, and buried inside its pages is something that academic historians, linguists, and theologians have quietly acknowledged for over a century. Yet mainstream audiences have almost never encountered. It is the final testimony of Eve. Her deathbed account of what the Garden of Eden actually looked, smelled, and felt like, delivered to her son Seth in the last hours of her life, before that memory disappeared from the earth forever. What she described does not simply contradict popular religious interpretations. It contradicts the assumption that the earliest humans were primitive, fearful, and intellectually limited. What she described was a world of extraordinary sensory complexity, ecological perfection, and what modern environmental scientists might call a fully balanced, self-sustaining biosphere operating at peak coherence. And the reason you have never heard this story is not because it lacks scholarly credibility. It is because the people who shaped the Western canon found her far more useful as a symbol of failure than as a witness of truth. Before we reveal what Eve said, hit like and subscribe. The Church never wanted you to know these truths. Tonight, we are going to change that. But to understand why this testimony matters so deeply, we first need to understand the precise moment in which it was given, because the timing itself is one of the most remarkable details in the entire account. The final witness. According to the scrolls, Adam died on a Friday, the same day of the week the text records as his original day of creation. Dr. August Dillmann, the German linguist at the University of Gießen, who produced the first full academic translation of this Ge'ez text in 1853, noted that this symmetry was not accidental. The ancient writers embedded it deliberately, as a structural signal to attentive readers that the narrative they were reading operated on multiple levels simultaneously. But here is the detail that changes everything. Eve did not die with Adam. She outlived him by exactly 6 days. And those 6 days, the scroll makes explicitly clear, were a conscious mirror of the 6 days of creation. Just as the Creator spent 6 days constructing the rivers, the animals, the mountains, and the stars, Eve spent 6 days releasing her connection to the world. One memory at a time, one breath at a time. What that means, if you follow the mathematics of the text, is that for nearly an entire week, Eve was the only living person on earth who retained a direct, first-hand sensory memory of paradise. Every human being alive owed their existence to her, and not one of them could share the weight of what she knew. She was, as Solomon Caesar Milan, the Oxford-trained linguist who produced the first English translation of this text in 1882, described her, the sole surviving repository of humanity's original experience. Malan wrote in his personal notes that the image of the first woman sitting alone at the mouth of a cave, refusing food and water, with her eyes fixed on the horizon, struck him as one of the most emotionally devastating portraits in all of ancient pseudepigraphal literature. He was not a man given to dramatic language. He was a Victorian academic, and even he could not remain detached from the weight of what that image represented. She was seated at the entrance of the Cave of Treasures, a sacred vault carved into a mountainside in the ancient Near Eastern Highland tradition, where Adam had just been interred. She was not eating. She was not sleeping. She was functioning, according to the text, as a conscious bridge between the physical world of her descendants behind her and the unseen world her husband had just entered ahead of her. That is not the portrait of a woman defined by a single mistake. That is the portrait of a scientist in the oldest possible sense of the word. A primary observer, sitting with her data, determined to transfer it before the last opportunity closed. And what she transferred to Seth in those final hours represents one of the most detailed, first-hand environmental descriptions of Eden that ancient literature has ever produced. The environmental record of paradise. Now, with that context established, we can examine what she actually said. And here is where the scientific dimension of this text becomes impossible to dismiss. The first thing Eve described to Seth was the light inside the garden, and her description does not match any natural lighting phenomenon that ancient people would have had vocabulary to invent. She did not describe sunlight. She did not describe fire or reflected moonlight. She said the light inside Eden did not originate from a single directional source. It came from everywhere simultaneously. The air itself was luminous. The ground reflected it. The leaves of every tree held it within their surfaces. Dr. Dillman, commenting on this passage in his 1853 translation notes, called it one of the most striking descriptions in all of Ethiopic literature, specifically because it had no parallel in any other ancient text he had encountered. A trained linguist working in the 19th century with no framework of bioluminescence, plasma physics, or quantum light behavior, simply flagged it as extraordinary and moved on. But a modern reader with exposure to current research into coherent biological light emission, zero-point energy fields, or the documented phenomenon of biophotonic radiation in living organisms, might find Eve's description considerably less mysterious. She then described the Pishon, one of the 4 rivers of paradise, and its riverbed. The gold lining that river, she told Seth, was not the gold of jewelry or currency. It pulsed beneath the water's surface. It moved. It behaved, in her description, like a living vein running through the body of the earth. The water above it was transparent to a degree she struggled to articulate. You could see every grain of that gold shimmering at the bottom, even in fast, deep current. Environmental geologists working in the Ethiopian highlands and the broader East African Rift Valley have documented extensive alluvial gold deposits in riverbeds fed by ancient volcanic formations, some of which exhibit the kind of reflective, current-driven shimmer Eve appears to be describing. Whether or not that constitutes a direct geographic match to the Pishon is a separate debate. What is not debatable is that her description is consistent with a real observed natural phenomenon, not a mythological invention. She spoke about the animals, how they exhibited no fear response in the presence of humans, how they approached Adam and her voluntarily. Behavioral ecologists who study prey animal psychology in environments without apex predators have documented exactly this kind of uninhibited approach behavior in species that have never encountered human threat. Eve was not describing magic. She was describing a functioning ecosystem in which the human organism had not yet established itself as a source of danger. And then she described the tree of life, and this is where her testimony becomes something that modern sensory neuroscience might find particularly interesting. She told Seth the tree of life did not produce a fragrance in the ordinary olfactory sense. It produced what she described as a presence, something that entered the respiratory system and reorganized the body's internal experience. Under proximity to this tree, she said, the neurological state associated with fear ceased to function entirely. Not suppressed, not overridden, simply absent. Contemporary researchers studying the relationship between certain terpene compounds, airborne plant emissions, and the human amygdala have documented measurable reductions in fear-associated neural activity in response to specific aromatic compounds in forest environments. The Japanese practice of Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, is built on peer-reviewed findings in this exact domain. Eve, describing the tree of life to her dying, did not have access to any of that vocabulary, but what she described is structurally consistent with it. What strikes researchers who engage seriously with this text is not that it sounds supernatural. It is that it sounds like a precise sensory report from a witness who lacked the scientific language to explain what she was observing, but retained the observational accuracy to describe it faithfully anyway. The vision and the restoration. Carrying everything she had just shared with Seth, Eve entered the fourth day after Adam's burial in a state the scrolls describe with clinical precision. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her eyes remained open. She was unresponsive to physical contact or verbal address. The text is careful to distinguish this from unconsciousness. Her body was present. Her awareness had relocated. What followed in the scroll is an account that Sir E. A. Wallace Budge, keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum, and one of the foremost translators of ancient Near Eastern manuscripts in the 19th and early 20th centuries, described as carrying a weight of redemption that transcended its textual origins. In her vision, the sky above the cave opened violently. The text uses language of tearing, not parting, not gradual revelation, but a sudden structural rupture in the visible sky. From that rupture descended a chariot composed of concentrated luminosity, drawn by 4 enormous winged beings whose wingspan and radiance obscured the surrounding atmosphere for a significant radius. And aboard that chariot, escorted by the archangels Michael and Gabriel, was the soul of Adam. Budge noted in his extensive commentary on the related Cave of Treasures texts that the motif of luminous garments being stripped at the moment of exile from paradise and restored at the moment of divine reception appears across multiple ancient Near Eastern textual traditions, including Syriac, Coptic, and early Mesopotamian sources. What made the Ethiopian account distinct in his assessment was the emotional and observational specificity of the narrative. It did not read, he wrote, like theological doctrine. It read like testimony. In the vision, Eve watched the angels wash Adam's soul in what the text calls the lake of Akarushin, after which his original garments of light, stripped from him at the moment of exile, were fully restored. His luminosity returned. And what that moment accomplished in Eve, according to the scroll, was the dissolution of something she had been carrying for centuries. The belief that the damage was permanent, that what had been lost could not be recovered. She watched Adam being received, restored, and welcomed. And in that moment her understanding of death shifted entirely. It was not, the vision showed her, an end point. It was a reversal, a return to the original condition. And that understanding transformed the final hours of her life from a countdown into a preparation. The first recorded prophecy. On the 5th day, Eve called every living human being to gather before her. The scrolls describe a convergence of thousands of descendants, moving from valleys and mountain ridges across difficult terrain to reach her. When they assembled and she rose to speak, the text notes something that historians of rhetoric and public address might find significant. She did not look like a woman at the end of her life. She looked, in the scroll's language, like a monument. What she delivered to that assembled crowd was a structured, prophetic address covering at minimum 2 major future geological and civilizational events, paired with a specific promise about the survival of the human lineage. First, she described a global inundation event, a flood of sufficient scale and force to cover the entire surface of the earth and eliminate the accumulating corruption she had already observed spreading through the early human generations. Flood geology and the cross-cultural prevalence of deluge narratives across ancient civilizations on every inhabited continent is one of the most documented phenomena in comparative mythology and geological research. Eve was not the only ancient source to describe it, but she appears to be among the earliest. Second, and more striking, she described a subsequent reckoning by fire. After the flood, further down the timeline than her audience could calculate, the world would face a second purification, this time through thermal rather than hydraulic means. This distinction between two sequential global catastrophes maps with notable precision onto current astrophysical and geological models of long-term planetary threat scenarios, including supervolcanic events, solar expansion projections, and impact-induced thermal cascades. She paired both warnings with a promise. Her bloodline would survive both events, and from within that bloodline, a specific descendant would accomplish something no human being before or since had achieved. He would re-enter the locked gates of the garden and bring the rest of humanity through them. Comparative religion scholars have noted that this is the earliest recorded articulation of a messianic promise in any surviving ancient text. And it was delivered not by a religious institution, not by an established priestly tradition, but by a dying woman sitting at the entrance of a cave, passing her final knowledge to a crowd of weeping descendants. The authority with which she delivered it, the scrolls are explicit on this point, was not the authority of speculation or hope. It was the authority of someone reporting what she had directly observed. The marriage of the grave. When she stopped breathing on the 6th day, the ground beneath the cave vibrated. The text is specific that this was not seismic activity in the conventional sense. It was a deep, rhythmic pulse, described using the same language elsewhere in the scroll, reserved for the beating of a living heart. The earth, in the cosmological framework of this text, was recognizing the return of the material it had originally contributed to her formation. Her sons performed what the scroll records as the first structured funeral rite in human history. The body was wrapped in white cloth. Aromatic spices from the surrounding highland forests were applied with deliberate care. The procession into the Cave of Treasures was conducted with what the text describes as the solemnity of a ritual, whose weight every participant felt, but none could fully articulate, because none of them had ever done it before. She was placed to the right of Adam, who had preceded her into the cave 6 days earlier. The scroll calls this the marriage of the grave. Two beings who had been formed, according to the text, from a single original structure, separated at the dawn of conscious life, expelled from paradise together, and now reunited in the soil that had produced them both. The moment her body was positioned beside his, the dormant offerings inside the cave, the gold, the incense, the myrrh, which had been stored there untouched for generations, began emitting a fragrance of such intensity and range that witnesses standing at significant distances from the cave entrance reported detecting it without being able to identify its source or match it to any botanical reference they possessed. Sir Wallace Budge, drawing on parallel accounts in the Syriac Cave of Treasures text, identified this aromatic event as one of the most consistently preserved details across multiple ancient manuscript traditions. It was not a theological embellishment added by a single scribe. It appeared independently in multiple manuscript lineages. Whether you interpret that phenomenon through a spiritual, biochemical, or historical lens, the consistency of its documentation across independent sources makes it a data point that serious researchers cannot simply dismiss. Why the record was suppressed, which brings us to the question that responsible scholarship must eventually answer. If this text has been known to Western academics since at least 1853, translated into English by 1882, and acknowledged by figures of the caliber of Dillman, Malin, and Budge as a document of significant historical and literary value, why is it virtually unknown outside of specialized academic circles? The answer requires a brief examination of how the biblical canon was assembled and what criteria governed the selection process. The councils and scholarly bodies that shaped the Western canonical tradition were not operating in a vacuum. They were operating inside specific institutional frameworks, with specific theological and social agendas that influenced at every level, which texts were elevated and which were marginalized. A text that portrayed Eve as a powerful visionary, a primary environmental witness, a prophetic voice, and a keeper of humanity's deepest memory did not fit the narrative architecture those institutions required. They needed Eve to represent a cautionary principle, a symbol of human susceptibility to error and its catastrophic consequences. The conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan offered something entirely different. It offered a woman of extraordinary cognitive and spiritual authority, delivering the most important information in human history from a position of complete physical depletion, with the precision of a scientist and the resolve of a commander. That portrait could not coexist with the one the canon required. So the Ethiopian monks held it, generation after generation, in the remote highland monasteries of a country that maintained its own ancient Christian tradition entirely outside the influence of Rome and Constantinople. These scrolls were preserved, studied, and transmitted. Not because the monks were contrarians, because they understood, as scholars like Dillman and Budge would later confirm from the outside, that without Eve's testimony, the record of human origins was structurally incomplete. She was not a cautionary tale, she was the first field scientist of the human race, the first environmental documentarian, the first person to look at a lost world with clear eyes and say, "Before I leave, let me tell you exactly what it was." And what she told us, if we are willing to listen, is that the world we inhabit now is not the original design. It is the consequence of a departure from it. And somewhere in the oldest surviving records of human memory, the blueprint of that original design is still preserved, waiting for the generation that is finally ready to take it seriously. The Ethiopian Bible may be the oldest key we have to that blueprint, and we have barely begun to turn it. If you found this examination valuable, subscribe and enable notifications. In our next exploration, we go deeper into the forbidden books of Ethiopia and examine what the post-flood scrolls reveal about the reconstruction of civilization, details that the standard historical record has never fully accounted for,